Okay, students, this is the final video for the Flip Classroom on the Cold War. If you are using your blue note packets, this is the fourth page, The Cold War Ends. The segment down here where it says the 90s, I'm born, we're actually going to do that in class on Friday and Monday of next week. So all your notes right here will be very brief, and you can put them right here. All right. First thing to just reinforce when we're talking about the Cold War is that, yes, it did span over 45 years, and there's a lot of points that I have more or less glossed over and kind of just given you an introduction to, just for the sake of introducing you to that concept. When you get to be a junior, you will explore a lot of the causes and effects of the Cold War in much greater detail in your junior year, and all the kind of the battles, the Vietnam War, the Korean War, the Cuban Missile Crisis. You'll spend substantial about more time talking about that. So this was just an introduction. Now we're giving you kind of the synopsis of the end of the Cold War. So the Cold War begins because of hostilities between the United States and the Soviet Union. And throughout the 1950s, 60s, and early 70s, the United States square off indirectly, okay, whether it's in North Korea, Cuba, other points in Latin America, other points in Europe, or in Vietnam even. These two countries square off. But beginning in 1972, relations begin to thaw. And this is what is known as detente. Detente. And remember in the second video, we talked about the U.S. or sponsoring elections in China by the Shanghai Shek and Chairman Mao Zedong becoming the communist leader of China. So throughout the 60s, the United States did not recognize China as a sovereign country. Well, in 1972, President Richard Nixon becomes the first American president to visit China. And here is a photograph of Nixon shaking hands with Chairman Mao. And basically, what Nixon does is he begins to open up relations with that country. And he realizes, because again, this is 1972, the U.S. is fighting that war in Vietnam. So Nixon realizes that China is going to be a powerful ally in kind of helping to bring an end to the war in Vietnam, believe it or not. So that is one of the first ways that the Cold War began to thaw. All right. The second way is, and this is a big one, I'd put a little star next to this, the Afghan War. All right. Now there were a couple other things that happened in the 70s that you're going to need to learn when you get to U.S. history too. Um, but one of the bigger ones is the Russians invading Afghanistan. Again, remember that domino theory. The United States and its allies were afraid that the communism threat, the Soviet threat, would continue to expand and spread to other countries. Well, in the early 1980s, the Soviets tried to gain a foothold into Central Asia by invading Afghanistan because Afghanistan had a strategic geographic point in the world because it could connect the Soviet Union directly with the Middle East and Arab oil. Well, the United States did not want that to happen. So the United States secretly sent weapons to the Afghan rebels. And gradually, the Soviets, realizing that they could not overtake the Afghan people and the country of Afghanistan, the Soviets began to fall back. And this actually marks a big turning point in the war, or in the Cold War, because it's the first time that the Soviets are really defeated on the battlefield. It's also important to understand because the United States gives weapons indirectly. This was done what's called covertly or very secretly. This was not on the front pages of the newspapers, but the United States secretly helps the Afghan people. The problem is, after the war, Afghanistan is ravaged. Their country is torn up, their villages bombed out, and this will allow a young man by the name of Osama bin Laden to kind of rally a militant terrorist group against the United States. And again, I'm just giving you the kind of the introductory facts because this is such a complicated history, especially in the Middle East. But when we talk about 9/11 and the terrorist attacks on September 11th, um, It just didn't happen. Osama bin Laden just didn't wake up and decide to attack America. It was a long time coming throughout the 90s and 80s, and one of the reasons for his resentment of the United States and its allies is because of some of the actions in Afghanistan, which stem back to the Cold War. So again, I need you guys to understand that a lot of the problems that we face today are in direct relationship to the Cold War, which was a fallout of World War II. So again, you guys hopefully are seeing the pattern of the 20th century. As early as World War I, we're stumbling from crisis and conflict to another. The big turning point comes in 1985, something called perestroika. This is a term you want to write down. Perestroika. Perestroika. The Soviet Union is now under a new leader. His name is Mikhail Gorbachev. And Mikhail Gorbachev realizes the Soviet economy is in trouble. Because remember, in class, we talked about that idea of everyone being fair, everyone being equal. And communism, again, looks good in theory, looks good on paper, but in practicality, it doesn't always work. And it didn't work in this case. So Mikhail Gorbachev tries to reorganize the Soviet economy to keep it going. And he gradually allows Russians to begin to own their own business. And that there is the big chink in the Soviets' armor. Because they're saying, the communist system is saying that the government should own that business. Well, now there's a little bit of free market politics, free market economics coming into the Soviets. And here is a photograph of Mikhail Gorbachev seated right here, and the U.S. president at the time, Ronald Reagan, as they begin negotiations. And Reagan sees this as an opportunity. Reagan was very much a hardliner against the Soviets, and he sees the opportunity to kind of put a nail in the coffin of the Soviets. And what he does, he increases our defense spending because he knows that if we start increasing our defense spending, the Soviets will try and match that. So he takes advantage of the Soviets and their weak economy. He then travels to Berlin. And in 1963, John Kennedy made a very famous speech at the same spot. Kennedy proudly boasted, he said, "Ich bin ein Berliner," I'm proud to be a Berliner, reaffirming the United States' commitment to the Berlin people. Ronald Reagan in 1986 travels to that very same spot, and he challenges Mikhail Gorbachev. He says, if you are committed to freedom and peace, he says, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And by 1989, in October, the Berlin Wall was in fact torn down, and Berlin, which had been divided since World War II, was reunited. And gradually, one by one, other countries that were under Soviet control began to fall apart and fall away from the Soviet Union. And by 1991, the Cold War was over, and the Soviet Union had imploded. Its economy collapsed. And the United States, as of 1991, 1992, becomes the only major superpower in the world. And this is probably one of the biggest, one of the iconic images of the Berlin Wall on Christmas Eve. A huge celebration as that wall was torn down and families were reunited. And again, that really meant the beginning of the end of the Cold War. And as I said a moment ago, with the end of the Cold War, there is one superpower in the world standing, and that's the United States. And we will talk about the United States in the 90s, and that really propels us into the modern day crisis, which we're going to talk about in class beginning on Friday. If you need to go back and view any of these notes again, please do so. If you have any questions, you can always post them on the Edmodo discussion forum.